and conscious of everyone's time during this busy period. So we'll kick off. I'm just going to open up with a karakia. Tutawa mai I runga, tutawa mai I raro, tutawa mai I roto, tutawa mai I waho. Kia tō ai, te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te tātoa, humie, huie, tai kie. Kia ora and welcome. Today's Titi Toki Mata Ora speaker series is focused on how we get technology into hospitals. The hospital, even as someone who works in Auckland District Health Board, is a bit of a black box for me to navigate. So I'm hoping that I can also learn some things from the speakers. Usually we have three speakers, but today we're lucky to have 4. And what we'll do is we'll get each speaker to introduce themselves and their background and what brings them here today. And once you've finished speaking, just pass it on to the next speaker. Just choose one of the 4. We'll get Brian to kick off.
Oh, thank you. Okay. So I'm based here in Wellington, and my background goes in this area. My background is originally in physiology, then pathophysiology, working in clinical areas. And in the late 80s, I got a role doing some research around my PhD in anaesthesia, clinical anaesthesia. And then suddenly within 6 months, I ended up becoming the sort of research person supporting a quality assurance program around safety. And at that time in the late 80s in Wellington, the equipment that they had in the operating theatres was sparse. It was pretty minimal. And a local businessman had been into the operating room with his son and was quite surprised about what he considered to be a lack of equipment, and got talking to his neighbour, who was the head of anaesthesia at the time, and they set up a trust. And somehow I found myself in this role looking at clinical incidents and equipment and what was going wrong with equipment and stuff like that. So that started a really strong interest for me around medical equipment and usability and safety, and how it's introduced, how it's assessed in the clinical environment, and how you validate decision making around, do you buy this sort of stuff? And that sort of snowboard, that springboard for me a real interest around that aspect. And that's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to pass on to my friend Andrew now, if that's possible.
Yeah, kia ora everyone. So yes, I really represent a range of different experiences. I've spent the best part of 25 years in healthcare. A lot of that time in the more traditional realms of pharmaceutical, biotech, health system and health service design and planning. And more recently, I'm currently part of the Wellington Uni Ventures, so the commercialisation team, also in Wellington. And through that time, I've really experienced, the range of different experiences when it comes to clinical trials, being able to access the hospital sector for that as well. I'm perhaps come from a more traditionalist view of what a clinical trial looks like, coming from the pharma biotech sector, and that's more traditional. But of course, what we see with new technologies is different approaches to the way in which technology evolves, is adopted, integrated within the healthcare systems and settings around the world. So I'm really interested in understanding and supporting that. Alongside my role at Wellington Uni Ventures, we also support the Health Innovation Hub in New Zealand, and that has a much more direct line to ensuring that innovations that both come from within the health system, but also working with innovators external to the health system, can work with and understand how best to validate, use and adopt their products within the New Zealand health system. So I'm perhaps wearing a few different hats and perspectives around this topic. Yeah, but really interesting and being able to make a contribution based on what I've seen and also some of the experiences that I've had myself. And with that, I will pass to Georgia.
Cool. Kia ora everyone, Georgia here. I'm a co-founder and CEO of Viewpoint Medical, so an early stage medtech company, finding our roots within the New Zealand ecosystem and health scene. My background stems from more academic, working alongside regenerative stem cell technology, so very lab-based technology and investigating that. And so my bridge into the medical device sector almost came around through a validation program that I did over the summer of my end of study, and it basically enabled me to kind of understand the entrepreneurship and health tech scene within New Zealand in 2016. And that enabled myself and a team to actually go ahead and do some more market validation and research within New Zealand, and actually also enabled us to propel ourselves into the European scene, which we did a more heavy-hearted technology incubation program that was specifically medical and device and diagnostic related. So I come from a scene in which there's a lot of technology development as well as startup iterating, as well as testing and then stress testing that. So hopefully throughout this an hour, I can provide some sort of context as to what I've seen through my years of being in early stage companies, as well as what the peripherals of other companies have been doing as well, and how they've applied themselves, not just within the New Zealand setting, but also overseas. Just a little bit about my company for just a bit of context. So we're developing an AI-guided imaging system that assists with vascular access as well as vascular diagnosis. So all things preventative. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. Over to the last speaker.
I think that's me. Hello everyone. I'm Haran Thabru. I'm a child psychiatrist, paediatrician and researcher at Starship Hospital and Auckland Uni. And I've been involved in a number of digital health projects, digital mental health projects over the last few years at Starship and elsewhere, trying to improve child and youth wellbeing and mental health in a number of different ways using technology, including developing games for anxiety and general well-being during COVID, and also for supporting young people who might be experiencing self-harm as well. And apart from co-designing and developing these interventions with the young people that I work with and their whānau, I've also been now kind of more in the space of trying to get them implemented when we've shown that actually they are cool and that they do work. So lovely to meet you all and looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, everyone. I'd just like to open it up to the participants to see if anyone has any burning questions after those introductions. You're welcome to unmute and ask them directly or post them in the chat.
I'll take a stab at one. Hi, everybody. This is Tyler Harmon. Thank you guys so much for doing this board. I really am looking forward to gaining the chance to hear from all of your knowledge. And I get this is sort of one for the panel. Whoever wants to grab it, feel free. But I guess in the industries where I've worked mostly in the U.S. in the medical device industry, that translation valley of moving from academics into the actual hospital environment, whether it's for validation work or for moving into the actual industry, is one of the larger challenges and something that I think academia has really struggled with in the US. Comparatively, it seems like there might be some more reasonable pathways that folks in New Zealand have found. I feel like there's a higher success rate of a lot of the projects that I've seen here. Is that something that you guys feel like is reflective of reality?
Absolutely. Just from our experience within, so we're liaising with Christchurch Hospital at the moment, and we've got a number of US advisors who have basically pinpointed and said, stay in New Zealand and pursue most of your clinical trials, as there is so much red tape within the US to facilitate all of those boundaries and obstacles that you might come across. So we've definitely found that through the liaison, and even how we found our clinical lead through a book club randomly, it enabled us to have those early conversations and really springboard into the hospital very quickly without a lot of obstacles in the way. So we've definitely seen that, and other projects that I've worked on outside of the startup have definitely come across in a very organic and quick nature. It's all about how that clinical lead you find comes on board and how passionate they are about the project that you're pursuing.
Yeah, that's something that I'm certainly see, and I think interesting, just to build on George's point there. I mean, a lot of this, if we look across the New Zealand health system, it can happen in a very organic way, but it is about making that connection as well with the right clinical lead that's going to deliver the right passion for those projects. So that's always a big question and of course, for many entrepreneurs, for many innovators, is trying to identify that right clinical lead, that right clinical champion that will take that idea forward. But really good example.
Andrew, can you elaborate? What are some ways in which people could connect, apart from book clubs, to clinical leads?
Well, I think there are a number of existing people within the ecosystem that can help support you through. So we, so in my role in the, with the Health Innovation Hub, so we do play an active role in helping make those connections, if that is desired, and that's not the only role that the HIH plays, but of course, it's important to make those connections. Of course, there are also key innovation improvement teams within DHBs and within and across the health system that are also important conduits as well to help identify those clinical leads. But of course, it is about establishing those connections with the clinical community as well. And I know there are other activities that continue to be underway to help establish that connectivity as well, to really connect clinicians and those clinicians with a passion key areas, with those problems or those problems to be solved.
Hiran, I know that you've connected with some startups and digital product developers, I guess. What do you look for when you choose to collaborate?
I guess I'm looking at particular fit with the environment that I'm working in clinically, the hospital environment. And I think every hospital is a kind of system, is a separate system, which has got its own quirks and its own kind of, positives as well. So I think often things that might be imported from outside are not kind of fit the purpose and environment where I might work. So I think looking for some enough fit, but also kind of ability to kind of modify and adapt kind of for local need is kind of what I'm looking at from a clinical perspective. As a researcher, I think developing interventions, even though I work in the place and I might develop them in the place, I do still think I suffer from the same issues that everyone else is suffering from, which is trying to get things actually implemented. And I know that at Starship, we've got the Starship Foundation, they fund a lot of research, but there isn't actually any funding for implementation. And I do think there's a gap there in terms of what is developed and what is funded and what is not in innovation, and how you kind of then get that to actually be embedded in the hospital system. So I think there's as much funding, processes and people, all those things are kind of vital, kind of bridging that gap. And I'm still trying to work on how we do that where I work.
Awesome, thank you. How about you, Brian? Any tips and tricks? You've kind of spanned both spheres. Oh, you're on mute.
It's important to, unmute is really the first step. Dealing with technology is one thing, but I think finding a champion is always the key principle. Somebody who is not necessarily enthusiastic, but somebody who has a critical mind about what it is that you're doing and can, I think, can provide sort of experience and feedback, I think would be a really, really useful approach to take. You may not find that everywhere, and so I think it's really just important to realize that sometimes you'll find those people who are really quick and interested, and then you'll get those people who aren't. And use your time wisely, you know, it's the 80-20 rule. You know, you'll probably find that 20% of the people are going to give you an 80% positive experience. And if you try and get those other people, it's going to not be the same. I was talking to the lead of infectious diseases here at the hospital about an app, a digital app that they created. And it was a really interesting one, because that for them was about getting champions on board and people who wanted to use the app, or people who valued it. And even though it's been successful, they still struggle with other medical specialties who don't see the value of having another medical professional group telling them which antibiotics to use. And you know, you just got to roll with those punches. You know, you're not going to change the world necessarily. It's just looking for where you're going to get the gains.
I'd chime in with a question if I could, and if I can figure out how to frame this on the spot, I suppose. If you have champions on board within the health system, as I think we do, we've got a lot of people that are quite enthusiastic about what we're doing at the clinical level. But there are so many levels in the health system that even though you may have some clinicians that are very keen on what you're doing, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get broad uptake within that health system, I suppose. And so I guess one of the things that's always puzzled me is if you have a technology that potentially could save a lot of health dollars, but of course the cost avoidance or those savings goes to another department, not the department who's actually purchasing the equipment. And I find that whole sort of scenario in the health system very difficult to navigate. That one budget, we want to buy the technology to serve patients and do good and save lives, yada, yada, yada. But then the savings actually goes to somebody on the other side of the hospital. And I found that very tricky. And then I wonder, as a second part of that question, and then I'm going to be quiet, with all of the changes in the health system, do we need to be targeting a district health board, 2 district health boards, or forget them and go to whoever lives in the land above that's organizing all of New Zealand? I guess.
I can completely relate, Maggie, to your first part of your spiel around navigating how the healthcare system works from the buyer and as well as your clinical team that's actually using and operating the equipment. We're going through challenges of understanding, and obviously with the new reform of how the healthcare system is going in New Zealand is going to be altered, how we go about talking to procurement and getting those budgets and understanding that whole sale cycle process and presenting a business case in which we've got amount of data to support the equipment or process being used and saving XYZ resource. Like, that's something that we're going to very closely in the near future be exploring, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of challenges with that and how to navigate that alongside the new system.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of points that have been brought out here. So one is definitely the importance of, as Georgia explained, kind of doing that validation, that work within the health system itself, or the intended system. But of course, what I'm hearing, and I think it's really important to distinguish between, clinicians as users and obviously as champions of new technologies against a procurement process, which obviously can sometimes show separation. And it's really important for any innovators to be aware of that distinction as well. And actually, the steps that are required to move from actually working with those champions and users of your technology to it potentially being bought by the health system, whether it be a DHB or more widely. And so We should also recognise that, of course, different technologies have different procurement processes as well. So that's the other point to be made. And also one of those areas which, we always like to make clear as well is depending on the nature and the type of technology we're talking about, it runs down a different line in terms of where it's likely to be procured, whether more centrally or potentially through nominal budget. So again, that's something that I would say for any entrepreneur, any innovator looking to work within the health system, not only around how do you get that clinical advocacy and that clinical uptake, but also that second point, understanding the different procurement processes at play.
It'd be nice if somebody would write a little book on that whole process. If you've got this kind of device, what are you referred to the steps you have to take to procurement? Well, what are those steps? I mean, I think that to me is the dark tunnel that you have to get from your clinicians who really want it to actually getting where it needs to be. There's this sort of very murky area that I find quite a challenge in getting through that. And in some respects, almost more in New Zealand than other markets, actually. So somebody needs to write a book for us, would be really nice.
Yeah. So I got in the murky muck when I connected with Georgia earlier this year to try and figure out what the procurement process looks like. And yeah, it is different for different technologies, for different DHBs, for different teams, for different types of relationships. But what we were told is that there is going to be a nationwide procurement process or processes that are going to be cohesive and coherent and basically the same thing for across New Zealand. So it's something to look forward to, hopefully.
I've got a question, and so Mark Robinson with Callaghan. Mine is actually, how do we get technology out of hospitals? Because there's some really smart clinician researchers and that are developing technology, and yes, obviously it's great within the DHB, but the I guess how the way that's amplified is getting it out, and so I'm interested in panel's comments around that.
We have one on the panel. Ivan.
I don't think there's any lack of interest from clinician researchers about doing work outside of a hospital system. Mostly we don't know what the other systems are, or we're not approached, is the short answer. But I think, yeah, if there are people who are doing things in fields that you're interested in, then just approach them, because I think those of us that are developing things would be passionate to kind of take on projects in any area if it was going to do good.
Yeah, I guess I'm sorry, Perrin, I was meaning really it's the entrepreneur clinician researcher. So it's not in terms of someone coming into the hospital and approaching them. It's actually about where they're dealing with an issue every day, and then they see a solution, and how to resolve that, and then
I guess we kind of
commercialize that.
Yeah, we tend to work. I mean, like I work at the university as well, so I mean, we do kind of commercialize some of the products that we do, like on this side of things, and whereabouts there's more support for us as researchers here to develop and commercialize products on this side than within the hospital system. So a lot of the people who are clinician researchers probably would have an academic role and have access to those university supports anyway. But again, they'd be within the constraints of academic and health-based institutions. Most of us are not, as much as we might be creative, and not natural entrepreneurs and have had no training or let alone kind of experience in terms of innovation until we find ourselves doing things and realize, oh, we might be the only person doing that, or there might be one other person in the country doing it. So it's great to kind of link with networks of people who are consciously innovating, who are entrepreneurs, who actually do have skills that we can learn from and we can partner with. So I think you probably find there's more openness than not amongst clinician researchers, is what I'm saying. But yeah, there aren't many forums for actually connecting those two worlds, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I guess that's the space that Te Toki Mataora is attempting to fill. And I'd like to see more proactive action taken on behalf of DHBs and providing those connections, finding those or providing avenues for the clinician innovators out into the ecosystem, whether it's through Te Toki Mata Ora or others. Ella, did you want to add to that? You've got your hand up.
Oh yes, I was just making note that there's a question in the chat was all. But yeah, I'll add on to that a little bit, and with regard to our e-health forum that we've got going, which is kind of trying to fill that gap of connecting clinicians to engineers and academics all interested in health technology. So I can put a link in the chat, and it would be great if anyone wanted to join it. But yeah, the question is from Faye. Faye, do you want to ask your question, or I can read it out for you?
I'll ask it. I'll come on, because as you probably all realise, most of you probably know me. I was, for the past 20 odd years, I was the CEO of the Medical Technology Industry Association. So I've dealt a lot with access into the DHBs, and all what you're saying is quite correct. There is quite a barrier to get in. They are probably the biggest barrier to getting your product to the patient. Certainly there is a process, there has been for many years, product evaluation committees in most of the hospitals, and just because you get the clinicians buy into it doesn't necessarily mean it gets through. But my question, it's not so much a question, it is a discussion. It's happening globally, but it's happening here too. You cannot approach and present your product without cost of effectiveness, comparative effectiveness. And this is demonstrating that your product has better benefits, but also cost benefits and effectiveness and outcomes than the current product being used. And that data has to be presented, and it's going to be more so as Pharmac is moving over to assessment, procurement and funding of medical devices. And this will all be centralised. They will take over the budgets from the hospitals eventually. It's underway now. And so companies will have to work with Pharmac. And as you know, Pharmac will have a budget. So you'll need to be able to demonstrate, pharmaceutical companies do this very well. The medical technology hasn't been as good as presenting this comparative effectiveness and demonstrating the cost effectiveness. But even some of the regulators overseas are now requiring it as you regulate as you register your product for regulations, you need this data, and it's going to become more important as you do your clinical trials. You also assess your comparative effectiveness with the gold standard. Unfortunately, New Zealand doesn't always have the gold standard product in New Zealand, so it's also very hard sometimes to do that comparison. But you will need more and more. That is how you're going to get your product, and a product's useless unless it gets to the patient. So getting into the DHBs, well, it will be Health New Zealand, and everything will be centralised to make it more equitable across the country of what products are presented in each hospital. You will need to be working with Pharmac. And but the other person who was talking about the different pathways, some products of course will go through different pathways within a hospital, but most of the majority will go through Pharmac. So that's my my offer to all those online thinking about getting into the hospital system. It's not straightforward, and you do need to work. We will be needing to work with Pharmac. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Faye.
Yeah, I had a quick question, if that's all right.
Go for it.
Yeah, Faye, thank you. That was actually right in line with what my question revolves around. So it's good to know that I'm not the only one that feels like it's a black box and I have no idea how to approach it. So there's a bit of comfort there. But okay, so my question are for those perhaps that have already done some clinical trials in New Zealand. So this data that we keep talking about, this cost effectiveness, how big of an impact did that have on the design of your clinical trial? Because I'm assuming this is, Faye, the data that you speak of, is it, being generated during a clinical trial? So if we're doing our clinical trial, we need to start really looking at the costs that we're offsetting, and yeah, how big of a how big of a role does that play when we're designing our protocols?
I think you have to, from day one, you have to, a product is only going to be successful if it's meeting a problem, if it's going to solve a problem. So part of your your STED, what they call your STED documentation, you have to start, you can't retrospectively go back. The whole time you have to be thinking as you take each step. And internationally, the clinical trials, there are ISO standards for the international standards for clinical trials for medical technology, and more that is being developed alongside. So you have to be thinking about it all the time, and it has to be part of your steps as you take your development of your product and through clinical trials. You need to engage, with both the clinicians, but also the hospitals and the bar, the procurement people, as you take clinical trials through. And more I'm saying to companies that you need to be setting up pilot studies. So you evaluate all of those aspects of your product to actually demonstrate that comparative effectiveness, because the hospitals are always looking how they can save costs. And it's also understanding value-based procurement, that the technology is only one part of delivering a treatment. It's one section, and it's a whole model of care, and how it fits in to that model of care to develop and improve. It's about patient outcomes, as not just clinical outcomes, but patient outcomes too, are being more developed internationally, and it's becoming more and more important to be able to demonstrate that. So I say right from word go, you have to be thinking about that cost of effectiveness and comparative effectiveness as to what you're developing against what's currently on the market. Okay, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. And again, when we're trying to go into the US and that information, I get a reimbursement consultant and they're looking into that. No problem in the US. It's just New Zealand where I'm struggling. So it sounds like I should try to find, the hospital that I'm targeting, and try to find somebody who's in procurement in that hospital and kind of get them involved from an early stage and asking them what they would want to see. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you're right. There, as I said, there are these product evaluation committees in most of the hospitals. I don't know where they're going to stand in the new makeup of the hospital sector, because, as I said, Pharmac's going to be doing this process. As you put your product in for assessment, they'll be assessing it and prioritising it for funding. So it's all up in the air a bit at the moment, but currently there are product evaluators that you can get engaged with. They're called PENs, and there are process. If you get in touch, they are identified in the hospitals, and you can work with them to set up a trial if need be. But they don't unfortunately will not don't trial products before they've got registration. Even though we don't have a registration process currently in New Zealand, we are under the way of Therapeutic Products Bill. So you do need to have it on WAND, the Ministry of Health. You have to actually have it notified to currently on the WAND database at the Ministry of Health to be able to sell it in New Zealand. And from placing it on the market, it has to be done within 30 days. But that will eventually become a registration process under the new Therapeutic Products Bill. But I would work with some of the product evaluation committees to assess your product.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Very, very helpful.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Faye. We're lucky to have you. Tyler, you've been waiting so long. Thank you for being patient.
No problem. I stole the first question. I need to get back in line. And first of all, Faye, thank you, because I think that actually synergizes quite nicely with the question I have. And thank you for instigating that, Natalia. So my next question is, we have a very unique ecosystem here in New Zealand where there isn't necessarily that pre-market clearance, pre-market approval process that's as rigid as there is in other markets. And I personally, that's a big part of why I brought my device to New Zealand, because I felt like the shortest point between A and B was having clinical objective evidence and then not having anyone stand in my way other than the hospitals, be able to get it into the hospital and start helping people. That was a big advantage when I was evaluating different markets to first be launching my products in. But now that we're pivoting and moving, through that therapeutic goods bill, to having some more globally recognized registration and clearance processes, I'm very interested in the panel, especially you, Georgia, because AI and machine learning being such a key part of your device. How do you feel like that's going to impact? Is that going to dampen innovation in New Zealand in any way?
Yeah. With regards to navigating that whole sector, and especially the data that we are gathering so we're actually just completed some feasibility trials with Christchurch. So we've developed just the last module of our AI. And so at the moment, we're in the very sort of early stages of understanding from the uptake of patient data and how that all of those regulations under FDA approval as well as CE mark, how that looks, and frameworking that for our roadmap. So there are a whole bunch of still questions and strategy and frameworks that we need to develop in order to make sure that our path to market, especially within the AI sector, is as concrete as possible without too many loopholes. And at this point, we're just still navigating that. So we're still very, very early on.
Awesome. Thank you, Georgia. And
yeah, sorry that not much to talk on that point as we're still very early stage. But yeah, there's definitely room for, I would love to have in the future conversations regarding this. I've spoken to the founder of Toku Eyes, who obviously, if anyone here is familiar, is doing AI retinal scans of the back of the eye for, I think, preventable blindness. So they're going through and understanding how that framework works in their sector. So I think it would be really valuable, and then even the next panel session to even discuss how those new integrations work within applying for US approval, or even into the MDR-CE realm, which is now at the moment undergoing a lot of changes. So that's super interesting to understand that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely some value in having maybe another one of these with sort of us machine learning AI founders kind of putting our heads together, because I think that we're all sort of operating in the dark, and hopefully we can shine a light for each other.
Definitely.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. No, that was very helpful. I'm just curious, does anybody else on the panel have any thoughts in terms of how that pre-approval process may kind of impact our cadence of innovation here in New Zealand?
I can help you in a way, because I've been dealing with global therapeutic regulations the last 20 odd years, but also I've been at the forefront of the proposed therapeutic products legislation here. Basically, if you for software, there is the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, IMDRF. If you go to their website, they do have a software as a medical device and the criteria, but the FDA has special criteria for some of this new software. And as you know, the regulators around the world are behind the eight ball because the technology is developing so rapidly. They've got huge problems. And Europe has just undergone a huge change in the applying for CED, the medical device MDR, and in the IVs as well. So there are, the regulators do have a process, but if you look on the IMDRF, there is a software, a paper, a whole workshop was on the software as a medical device. But basically, if your product is claiming a therapeutic benefit, a therapeutic claim, it becomes a medical device. But software integrated into a product is part of that product, but if it stands alone, it has to be a separate medical device. And the criteria around that, FDA has some quite good guidance on that. Especially, it's not everything, but if it's creating, there's our stages of class 3 high risk ones. especially in devices and diagnostics. So there is a lot of data around, but certainly the FDA, I think, have some very good guidance on that, and they do tend to be globally accepted too. For New Zealand is going to be the therapeutic products will have unilateral recognition. So if you do have internationally recognised and to what they call the GMTA, the GHTF, the essential principles, if you develop your product to those essential principles, which are on the IMDRF, international, and the conformity assessment process is done to the ISO 13485, that's your basis. But your software is another set of principles. So, as I said, you need to be understanding that, but the regulators are rapidly trying to keep up with it. But good luck with the AI and the software, because if it's, even patient management records are becoming in Canada, they are a medical device. You have to register them as such, but not every country's at that point yet. Yeah. Okay, does that help you, Georgia?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of evolving sorts of things going on, and we've spoken to a whole bunch of medical startups based in here in New Zealand who are on implementing AI machine learning within their technology, as well as what's happening overseas, seeing and understanding how they navigate those pathways. It's always it's great to have a community so you can actually grab some nuggets of gold of how to actually navigate that whole thing.
Well, with the therapeutic products bill coming through, in fact, I think it's going to be presented by the end of this year, they will be reflecting what's happening overseas. We're not going to be reinventing everything here in New Zealand. We haven't got the resources, and we don't have the expertise here. So my suggestion is that you will have to reach out to have conformity assessment. You will have to reach out internationally. It won't be done here in New Zealand. And so that's certainly the FDA will CE mark is certainly ways to go. And again, with Brexit, the UK, is trying to develop its own one. So that's unfortunately where you have to be able to identify if your product's going to be medical device and have to be registered or not. But the FDA guidance are very good.
Amazing.
Yeah, I agree with that, Faye, and thank you so much. And I think that last point is exactly what I was trying to search at, just to sort of clarify my question, was that because it's sort of reflective of the international standards and mechanisms that are in place, there's no sort of fear about there being a dampening of the cadence of innovation, because so long as we as founders and innovators are following the international guidance, we should still be able to work with the New Zealand market. Okay.
Correct. Absolutely.
Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much.
Cool. Brian, you've also been waiting patiently, and then we'll go to Rohit.
Yep. This is just sort of a comment to what we were talking about previously. And I think one of the things that distinguishes healthcare in New Zealand, just talking to people who have worked in overseas and having worked in a hospital in the States as well, one of the things that's really important in New Zealand is we don't sort of track each individual item by patient. And so the use of certain equipment, actually, if you actually ask a hospital, if you go to procurement, they quite often struggle to tell you, how many catheters or whatever are used per procedure, because quite often in hospitals, they can come from a variety of sources with a variety of names, and they aren't terribly specific. So at one stage, I was in a meeting where they were concerned about the cost of catheters, intravenous catheters, and I was responsible for the IV therapy nurses train at that stage, and I thought this is really interesting because I couldn't understand why this was happening, and it was because there was an introduction of an electrophysiological service where they do cardiac ablations, and suddenly they were using these extraordinarily expensive, what were classified as catheters, that sort of blew the budget completely out from what they were anticipating. So we need to be really careful in terms of who you talk to in procurement or anyone else, that you know exactly you're talking the same language, or else you could get a very confused story. That's all I have to say about that.
Thank you. Rohit,
Yeah, thanks.
go ahead.
So my question is a little bit more on the commercial side. I suppose it's for Georgia. So what is your experience in pitching to venture capitalists and hospitals? Do you have to change the way you pitch depending on which organization you're talking to? Any
Absolutely.
unexpected portions that you encountered?
What was the last part of the question, sorry?
What were some unexpected things the hospitals looked at that like venture capitalists didn't really look at, or your TTOs?
Yeah, so definitely, yes, the first part of the question. We have a whole suite of presentations / pitches that we have depending on the group that's in the room. And our presentation to VCs is more quite broadly on what the problem and the solution, the technology that we're developing, but more so heavily focused on the commercial model and how we're actually going to execute that path to market, what our goals are for that company. And then from the clinical side, it's more depending on who the clinical team is involved. So maybe we've presented to the VIA Innovation, Helen's on the line from VIA Innovation, and basically outlining the proposal of what we're wanting to achieve with the trials and the outcomes, as well as how we're actually going to execute it with our clinical team, as well as presenting to clinical teams within the hospital, more articulating the actual protocols and workflows of how we want to basically provide value to patients, as well as value to the end user being, whether that's a nurse or a clinician. And then the kind of different obstacles of, or like what sort of questions we get asked. We're developing a cost benefit model. So kind of going back to Faye's point around how to actually build data, which from our feasibility trials, and accumulate that and develop it so that our clinical trials have a robust format to, I guess, finally get some data that can support the entire company's ability to move and actually sell into hospitals is what we're creating. So the time in which a procedure is performed is one of our key metrics using our technology, as well as other additional parameters as in amount of resource and time to delays within surgery and times of escalation. We're recording that within the hospital environment, which is very tricky to do. So we're at the moment mapping out our clinical trials and how those metrics will be defined within the hospital.
If I may, I do just want to briefly expand on that. So the way the healthcare system works in America, which is one of your major markets, is substantially different to the one in New Zealand. So if you are speaking to American hospitals, how have you further had to change the way you pitch? Because American hospitals just generally want more patients. They don't want less, because if they get less, they reduce money.
So we haven't had any further conversations with American hospitals, US hospitals. We've actually been more focused on the New Zealand market to really and simulate how those trials will actually play out. We do plan to migrate our trials later stage to the US, and we're also working with healthcare management providers and insurance providers to endorse that reimbursement code. So that's a huge part of our company, is the reimbursement strategy of how exactly under regulation, how that works seamlessly together for that US entry.
Yeah, thanks for that, Georgia.
That's all good.
Cool. Any final questions before we close off? Or comments?
I'll just jump on. Hold on, I'll put my video on. I've got a question, or I'm going to ask this question in a very open way, just to see what sort of response I get. What is the ideal sort of business model if a health system is going to bring in a technology? What business model is best suited? You know, is it a one-off purchase? You know, more upfront capital and leave it at that, or is it leaning more towards a software as a service SaaS model? Or is there resistance to that particular way. And there's a lot of other business models out there that can happen. I'm just interested to discuss the topic a little bit.
Is anyone able to talk to that from the panel?
Well, I think the experience I've seen, both my own experience in the health system, not only in New Zealand but overseas, but also with the Health Innovation Hub, is there's a range of different business models that operate as well. So, and that goes back to that earlier question about defining the type of technology, defining the type of, how capital intensive that use may be in terms, and this again all goes down that line of what's the most appropriate engagement and procurement pathway that's going to be right for that technology and solution. So I think it really depends. I'm not giving you a clear answer because I think that is it does vary. I don't necessarily think that there is a door that's closed to any one of those, one type of business model or another, or one type of approach. So I think but it is about understanding that. And of course, what I've heard here collectively is that, we could probably do a lot more to understand what's in sometimes a really gray area for those technologies.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. So before I close with karakia, I thought we'd do a gratitude waterfall. We've had some amazing conversations here today. So if everyone who has attended today could, in the chat, type a key positive takeaway that they've taken from the amazing speakers that we've had today, type it, and then I'll tell you when to send it. So we've got about 10 seconds to type something, and then I'll tell you to send it all at once and hopefully not break my computer. Okay, send. Very cool. Awesome. Thank you all so much. I'll just close with karakia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, kia tinako. Te tinana, te wairoa I te ara takata. Koia rā e rongo whakairia ake ki runga. Kia tina, tina, huie, tai kie. Thank you all so much. This has been awesome. Ella put in a link to the eHealth forum if you wanted to continue having these conversations with all of us and continue building this community of innovation. And we can send a link in an email follow-up as well, if you like. Thank you all for your time, and we'll catch you next month or next week if you're going to the to Health Tech Week. Ka kite.